Hey guys, it's Justin, aka Hambone, just here to let you know a couple of things that we have going on with the channel. One, we have a Patreon. If you can and want to support us, you can do that. As little as $1. You can join the Discord. We also have a merch store where you can get some cool shirts, mugs, and stuff with all of our different shows and labels on there. And thank you for all of our supporters that have already been there with us.
It's for real.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first edition of the Nostalgia Crackdown. I'm Adelia, that's my buddy Josh, and we are here to talk about the Schmoedown, which may seem strange to some people because the Schmoedown doesn't exist anymore, at least the way that it did this time last year. But even though the Schmoedown itself may be over, that doesn't mean we can stop talking about it. I mean, it's living on in my memories. I know it's living on in Josh's memories. And there's a lot of stuff from the Schmoedown over its 9 seasons that we never got to cover on the original Schmoedown Crackdown show. And so here we are to talk about that stuff. Josh, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to get into this project. As you said, even though the Schmoedown is over, it doesn't mean there isn't things to look back on, because for a lot of people, it was a very important part of their lives. It was something that people got extremely invested, and it felt like Schmoedown was, out of all the things I was a fan of, it felt like the Schmoedown had the most invested audience in some ways. People truly love the product, sometimes for better or for worse, and there's a lot of interesting things to look back on to see why people were that invested and captivated, and why the Schmoedown was so great and dominated some people's minds for couple of years, and really kind of go into the nostalgia a bit. It's always fun to go into nostalgia, at least, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to start beginning with this with a shout out to Ty Lieberman, the Tyrant, who planted the seeds of this idea in my head with a DM that he sent us back when the Schmoedown was announced to have been ending. We said, you know, nostalgia podcasts are kind of a cool thing to do, and it turned into this idea, and we'd love to have Ty on the show at some point. That would be a lot of fun. So open invitation for you, Mr. Lieberman, at any point. We're doing the show once a month. It's not going to be weekly. And we're not going to be going through the Schmoedown match by match in the order that they happened. I did some math that might be wrong, but according to my math, if we were to talk about one episode of the Schmoedown a week, every week, it would take us a little more than 13 years to cover the whole 9 seasons. There were that many episodes going on of this show. But what we are going to do is talk about the moments, the storylines, the tournaments, the people that made the Schmoedown what it was. And there will be some episodes that are dedicated to one specific match that was incredibly impactful on the league and its history. But right now, we're just going to talk about a topic. And Josh, you want to let everybody know what we're talking about today?
Absolutely. So today we are talking about the importance of the structure of the Schmoedown. I'm going to explain that topic just quickly before we get into it. To me, what drew me into the Schmoedown personally was the gameplay. It was the technical. I wasn't one of those people who was immediately enthralled by the story, but the game captivated me, and it was one of those things, as the more I watched, the more I started to enjoy and get invested. I think a large part of that is the structure of the Schmoedown. So we're going to go by each round, and by each round, we're going to talk about how did this round help captivate the audience, make an entertaining game, and make it also very interesting for competitors in a lot of ways. I think by looking at the importance of the structure of each round, but also the structure of the Schmoedown in general, and going honestly pretty technical in it, I think there's a lot to discuss, and also a lot to understand on the captivation of why it works so well and why it was such a fun product.
Absolutely. So let's get started with round number 1.
Absolutely. So what I would say about round number one, it's the perfect setup. It's the perfect like get your toes, build up type of thing because you don't want to start out too high or too low. And round one does that perfectly. I'm not going to say easy questions, but they're very straightforward questions. And a lot of times it gets the audience involved, or at least like involved in some way, because some of those questions you could answer even if you're not a big movie fan. I wasn't a big movie fan, but it was always like a joy when a question would come up and I would be like, oh, wait, I know this one. I remember this trailer. I'm able to answer it. It's just a
Yeah.
fun feeling that just kind of like, because if the game's not, if you can't play along unless you're a super movie fan, the game's not going to be as captivating. People aren't going to tune in as much because it's like not a lot of people have the time to be super movie fans. A lot of people have time constraints, budget constraints. Not everyone's able to see a movie every single day or week or be able to have a memory like that. But when you're able to at least early on as the audience get one, it feels very nice. Now, for me, that was animation usually or MCU. Those were the two topics where I'm like, I can feel pretty good, where I can get about, I wouldn't even say 8 out of 10, but like 5 to 6 out of 10 sometimes. Like Adelia, what topic, when you were watching around along, was there a specific topic that you were able to just get more often than not?
I was pretty good at the MCU questions, and I was pretty good at the Middle Earth questions in the Inner Geekdom matches. General basic movie trivia, like in a singles match or a teams match, I didn't know much of anything. But when I did get one in round one in one of those matches, it made me feel really good because, like, oh, I can answer this. And that engaged me in the match even further. So I totally understand what you're saying there, Josh.
Absolutely. And I think that shows that we're both big, not huge movie fans. We like our stuff. I'm a huge MCU fan. You're
Yeah.
MCU, but you also like The Hobbit. But if the Schmoedown was only able to captivate people who had were extreme movie fans, then it wouldn't have a big enough audience to survive for as long as it did. The reason
Right.
why it was able to captivate so much normal, I wouldn't say normal because it's normal to watch a lot of movies, but captivates so many people, the everyday man, the people who don't know everything about every movie. I feel like a large part of that comes from round one. And round one is, as I said, a great stepping up. It builds up and kind of switch it to the competitors. For the competitors, it's a great warm up. It gets you into the rhythm if you're a good competitor. And I wouldn't, again, I'm not going to go into like the difficulty because it's subjective, but they were very straightforward, easy questions. And if you played the game a bunch, you would understand, oh, okay, these are the types of round one questions I'm going to get. There's going to be maybe one where they're going to try and trick us or in some way. But for the most part, the top players were doing consistently well because it was a warm up for them in some ways. And I think that's how it's supposed to be. You don't want to have it be too high stakes early, but too low stakes early. I think round one was the perfect place where it's like, it's important, it matters, and the competitors have to be on their game. However, it's still a good warm up in some ways for them, where it's like, okay, we're kind of getting into the rhythm of the match. We're not fully there yet, but we're able to go on this rhythm in a way. Do you agree, Delia?
Yeah, I do agree with that, Josh. And I think that the fact that it was also a variety of categories was a good test of everyone's knowledge. There was a little bit from, horror and a little bit from drama and a little bit from comedies and so on and so forth. And that kept the questions constantly challenging enough for someone who might not know as much about horror or drama or comedy. But if you did know that, then it was like a nice, like you said, way of easing yourself into the match, which was great.
Absolutely. And also to expand on that point, not only were you had different categories, the questions were also structured differently. Sometimes you would get a comedy question, but that's secretly a movie release date question. Sometimes you would get a what's called a director's question, but it really was about the actors and knowing which actors appeared in what films. And sometimes you get a question about a director or an actor or a specific movie. Or as I said, there were a couple times where they would throw in a movie release dates question, and usually not as much in round one, but you did feel like you had that variety. And I feel like also there were moments where the writers were able to play around a little with the questions in round one, like those questions where it's like, who did not appear in this film, and list a couple actors. I always thought those questions were really interesting and a great way to just kind of use a different part of your brain, which was really nice.
Yeah, shout out to the question writers for sure, because they really came up with a tremendous amount of questions. Like, I have no idea how many questions were actually asked, individual questions asked in these 9 seasons of the Schmoedown, but it had to have been a bunch. And the fact that each one of the questions was different enough from the previous question, it wasn't like, okay, let's just spend 10 minutes answering which actor was in which movie. There were a different variety of questions, and I always really appreciated that. So shout out to the question writers. Great job, guys.
Honestly, we could rename this episode shout out to the question writers, because this the structure does not work if you don't have excellent question writers who understand the game, understand the format, and are writing the right questions for each round. And as we're going to probably again say shout out to the question writers a couple of times, because they really make everything work. And the questions questions are an extremely important part of the structure. And the Schmoedown wouldn't be where it is without the question writers. And they're usually the unsung heroes who often sometimes, everyone remembers the bad question, or the question that was maybe a bit too hard, or maybe your favorite competitor lost on. And it makes you but it's always important. It's why also this is a bit of a side, but I never liked a competitor going after the question writers, even if it's a heel move. I think there's just some things you have to just take off the table, and I think that never worked. But going back to round one, I do also want to talk about the importance of round one for the competitors, because when you're watching the game, you want to feel like round one matters. You don't want to feel like the game is over after round one, but you want to feel like it matters. And what made it work is it mattered the perfect amount. It wasn't like if you have a bad round one, it's over. A lot of people were able to come back and have great comebacks because they start off with a bad round one. However, if you're down more than 3 points in round one, that's kind of brutal. It's kind of something where it's like, oh, okay, you can come back, but that's a big difference. And that could definitely decide the match. We had matches where a competitor lost because they missed one question in round one, which is crazy to think about, really. And what I also love about the importance is you can remember if the score was 11-11, that would feel completely different if the score was 11-9. And that would feel, and those two feelings would be completely different to like an 8-7. If it was 11-11, it's like, oh my God, first person who misses is going to lose the match. You see just two competitors at their height going round and round, punch for punch, and it's like, oh, this is going to be a bunch of right answers, and it doesn't feel like anyone's going to miss ever. And we don't know if there's any small mess up that could be the end of the game. You think about 11-9, it's like, oh man, both these guys are at the top of their game, but that could be the end of the game. That could absolutely end the game, because competitors can go perfect, especially in the later seasons. You look at that 11-9, it's like a 2-point difference that might bite that competitor in the butt in the end. That might be the deciding point of the match, and it's already round one. And then if you look at 8-7, I feel like that was like the defensive struggle, if you will. That was like, oh man, these question writers, they really did a good job on this like high stakes match. Man, it's going to be like a tough, and you didn't feel like they were going to go perfect, but like, it's like, oh man, it's going to be such an interesting match. I wonder if they're going to get back in the rhythm or like have a perfect round two, or is it going to continue to be a defensive struggle? Can you, would you agree with that, Adelia?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I'd say that evolved over the course of the Schmoedown too, because we didn't always have 10 questions in round one. That was just in the later seasons. When it was in like an 8-5 scoreline at the end of the first round in previous seasons, that was a different feeling as well, because like it was 3 points, like it was a lot, but you always got the feeling that somebody wasn't quite out of it at that point. And then once perfect rounds and the bonus points started to become a thing, that added a whole new component to it, and that made some really exciting, interesting matches when there were perfect rounds, especially if both competitors got a perfect round, because like you said, then it was like, okay, who's going to miss first? Is that going to be the decisive blow? When someone checked to multiple choice in round two, that immediately like changed the complexion of that match. So the perfect round, I think, is something that was a great, I don't want to say invention because perfect rounds were happening, but like the bonus point added into the gameplay really made that change the importance of round one slightly, because it gave competitors a lot of momentum when they had a perfect round plus the bonus point.
Absolutely. And I will say, I love the bonus question. I think it's a great point of the match because also, if you go perfect in round one and miss the bonus question, that's another thing that feels kind of different where it's like, oh, okay, you can keep the momentum. But also, I just love it because it adds a new aspect to the game. It gives more incentive to go perfect, which I think there should be a lot of incentives for players to go perfect. Because, listen, a 1 point difference is much different than a 2 point difference when it comes to round two. 1 versus 2 point, every point matters. And we're going to get into that why. But again, it's like 1 versus 2. The fact that they were giving, you can miss one question and be down 2 points, that's huge. That's absolutely huge going into round two. I absolutely agree.
And we had some examples of bonus points coming into play. Robert Montano gets a perfect round plus the bonus in the first match he ever played when Late to the Party took on Team Action in season 4. I remember watching that and immediately being like, oh, these guys are good. And him especially. Like, not that Vanessa wasn't good. Vanessa was amazing as well. But Robert really set the tone for what to expect with him in round ones with that very first perfect round in round one.
Absolutely. And I'll say quickly, for newer players especially, and this is something I just thought about, for newer players, getting a good round one gave you a huge amount of hype going forward. Like you said with Robert. It's like, I remember Paul Oyama doing so well in round one, and it's like, oh, he's the real deal. He's going to be a competitor to watch. And in fact, I think this goes both ways. Sometimes if a newer competitor has a bad round one, we write them off way too fast or way too early as a certain type of competitor because it's general movie knowledge and the do worse in round one. Sometimes people make the wrong assumptions of being like, oh, well, obviously, if you're so good at the Schmoedown, it's all about general movie knowledge. And if you can't do good in round one, how can we trust you to do good in the later rounds to a certain extent? And I think you got to understand sometimes the questions just fall as you will. Sometimes the ball doesn't bounce your way in basketball. Same with questions when it comes to the Schmoedown. But it really was something where it's like if you consistently got perfect rounds, even if you weren't winning, you'd be thought of a certain way. That for a while with Brandon Hanna, he was doing so well in round one, but he wasn't winning his matches. But people still viewed him as a certain type of competitor, at least early on. Then the round one kind of dipped, and also he continued losing at some of the important matches. But it just showed the type of competitor he was in some way, and he got people excited in that sense. Coming from a Brandon Hanna fan. But there's a lot of very memorable moments of round one, like Robert going perfect, getting the first perfect round. But also, I'll quickly say, this is the one that always sticks out to me. This is Ben Bateman and Mark Riley versus The Odd Couple with Jeff Snyder and Mark Andreyko. First question of the game. Andreyko writes Alba instead of Alba. And it gets challenged. And what that shows is like, oh, every point matters. The fact that Who's the Boss thinks they can stop Andreyko from getting that perfect round, they have to use a challenge on that. And they believe it. It's like, listen, the margin for error for these top teams were so little, especially in round one. It's like we could win if we win this challenge, so they're going to use the challenge. But it also showed just like another aspect of round one, which was the whiteboards. It was writing things correctly. It was being able to not only know the right answer, but also not be dinged by spelling it completely way wrong or to pronounce it correctly in some ways. And that wasn't always a part of the game, but that is an important part of being correct. And I just love that moment because, again, it just shows you first question of the game, they throw out the challenge and they have a very valid, I think it was talked about how much people were going back and forth and how if you ask a bunch of people, it felt like it was 50-50. Some people agreed with the challenge, some people didn't. But to me, that's like one of the most memorable moments of round one, just because of how important it showed round one was.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that moment. I remember watching that match and just going, my initial thought was, you can't give that to Andreyko. Like, I understand that Idris Elba is the answer, and Alba is close to that, but that's a completely different last name. I've sort of come around on we gave him the benefit of the doubt because he clearly knew who he was talking about because he gave that story about his friend that worked on that film while he was giving the answer. But I totally understood why Ben Bateman challenged that, and I do kind of still think that Who's the Boss should have won that challenge. What about you?
I actually agree. I think Who's the Boss should have won that challenge because you get into a weird place when it's like giving competitors the benefit of the doubt. And that's why in the later seasons, they started making a rule book and making it set in stone in certain ways, because you can be given the benefit of the doubt to a certain extent. But like, listen, I can take a math test. I'm a math major. I can take a math test and my professor can give me the benefit of the doubt that I know the process is correct. But if I accidentally write 2 + 2 = 6, I'm not getting the maximum amount of points. He's not going to mark that down as correct. Even if it's a small mistake like that, if you put a wrong answer, it's understandable how you got there. And it's like, we can give you the benefit of the doubt that you knew the answer. But it's the same thing as like in basketball, shooting a buzzer beater when when the clock hits 0, but you're only half a second past it hitting 0 and you make it. As much as that sucks, you can't really give it to him. If this is viewed as a competitive sport, sometimes you have to draw the line when it's like, if we have to give you the benefit of the doubt to give you the point, then we cannot give you the point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. Another example of perfect rounds, and I think this is the first time this ever happened, was Alex Damon versus Joseph Scrimshaw live in Chicago at the live event there at Star Wars Celebration, a Star Wars Championship match. They both went perfect in the first round. I think that's the first double perfect rounds in a championship match, if I remember correctly. And just the pressure of doing that in front of 1,000 people watching you, not to mention all the people watching on the live stream like I was. I just remember being so impressed with the two of them and how incredible that match was. What about you, Josh?
Absolutely. I mean, whenever competitors compete live, I'm always amazed by it. I have stage fright for the most little things, let alone
Me too.
1,000 going in front of thousands of people and just competing like that. And also that also reminds me, it brings up the point that round 1 felt different depending on the division you were in. Star Wars, if you missed a round 1 question and your opponent did it, that felt like the end of the match, period. That was like, okay, we might have to just turn the match off. We don't need to watch the rest, just because of how elite those competitors were at Star Wars, especially as the seasons went on. In IG, it felt more rare, even though the top competitors did it. It did feel kind of rare at moments for the perfect round. I don't know why. Maybe it's because there's much more single matches than there were IG, and I might be having bias by that. But once you got a perfect round in IG, I felt like that put you, especially if you did it consistently, that felt like it put you a set above. It put you like, oh, this is, if you can get a perfect round in IG because of how specific the questions are, how difficult the questions are, I'm like, okay, you're legit. You can, I don't want to say win a title, but you could get to a number 1 contenders match just from your knowledge alone, probably. And then in teams is so interesting because in round 1, because you have 2 players, you have much more points available in round 1. So in some ways it's more important, but it's just so interesting where it's like the round 1 questions in teams, it's like, well, one person can go perfect, one person can miss. In fact, sometimes in teams, one person can be holding the team up by going perfect. I think Chance has done that once or twice in Corruption, where it's just like Mike might be having an off round 1, and Chance is just holding down the fort, getting a perfect round 1, and keeping them in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you bring in the teams aspect, there is also the JTE rule coming into play, where one teammate needed a JTE in the round 1, and you always felt like, oh, that's a burning JTE really early, but it was usually worth it because it got them to get the enough time to think about the correct answer. And then if both teammates had to use a JTE in round 1, that was a big deal too. But yeah, the difference of the importance of round one for the different divisions was definitely something that we should have brought up, and I'm glad you did, Josh.
Absolutely. And I'll also quickly say that like it felt different in teams because it's interesting because people would burn JTEs in round one, and I don't think we would bat an eye usually. And maybe part of that was Ben Bateman going on backstage and talking about like how important it is to burn those JTs because you don't know when you're going to need them, especially in round one. But like because it felt differently because you had a partner. It's like, oh, I need more time, but I'm giving my partner a disadvantage basically by using this JTE because I'm the only one answering this question. So now my partner has to go into the rest of the match with only 2 JTEs because I can't get there fast enough. And that's an interesting aspect psychologically for competitors competing in the moment. But also, like, that's why I think it felt different, which is so interesting. And again, why the structure of the rules just works so well to build entertainment, to build stakes, and to build tension within the matches.
Absolutely. Let's move on to round 2, the wheel round. There was a lot of fun for the wheel round for the audience, both the people that were at the studio watching the matches being filmed and those of us that were watching through our computer screens, our phones, whatever it happened to be. There were a lot of good moments that came just from the spinning of the wheel in round number 2.
Absolutely. Like to me, I always call round 2 the climax because in some ways it's just wheels are fun, man. Wheels are just fun. Like spinning wheels. I try to put wheels into any type of like series or thing I'm doing with my friends if we're trying to do something because it's just fun to spin the wheel in that sense. But it's also there's this moment of like, for example, if you're going up against Rachel Silvestrini, you see Kevin Smith on the wheel and you're spinning that wheel. The audience is going like, oh my God, is it going to land on Kevin Smith? If it lands on Kevin Smith, then the opponent might be in trouble. And then as an audience also, I think we had Meryl Streep chants going all the time because of just people latching on to certain categories. In the last season, it was the wild cards, but also that dread of opponent's choice or seeing your opponent get spinners. And that it's interesting I say dread because I don't think it was ever optimism. It always felt like if you're the competitor or the audience, it was something bad was going to happen rather than something good. It never felt like you were going to spin spinners. It always felt like you were going to spin opponents. And the idea of like you spinning a category and now being like, okay, do I risk it or do I spin again? How do I feel about this category? And the audience has no idea how you feel about the category. So we're all in tensions like, oh, is he good at this? Is he not good at this? Does he feel confident? Is he thinking about spending again? There's so many aspects of it that just make it a fun experience in the moment where it's just like you hold your breath for a bit, but in a fun way, almost like going on a roller coaster.
Yeah, absolutely. And we got a little bit of insight into what the managers and the competitors would discuss when first wheel spin happened during the digital era, because we could hear them talk to each other. And I always found that fascinating. It was one of the things that I really kind of missed about season 9 is we couldn't hear those conversations anymore. There was also those couple of seasons, I think it was a couple of seasons anyways, where every time somebody stepped up to the wheel, we'd hear spin from the wheel, not the pegs. That became a whole thing with the fans. And of course, there was the Scott Mantz scream every time it landed on movie release dates, which is ingrained in my mind and I can still hear to this day. But the strategy of the wheel round was one of the things that made it the most enjoyable for me. Do you spin away from a slice that you've landed on that might be a strength for your opponent? Or is it something that you're okay at, but there might be better things, but there might also be worse things on the wheel for you? Are you going to take that risk of getting something worse just to try to get something better? Like you said there, it was kind of almost a chess match when it came to choosing what you put on the wheel for those exact reasons, because the competitors got to pick the slices for the wheel. And do you pick one of your strengths that might be a weakness of your opponent? Do you pick one of your opponent's weaknesses, hoping they land on it? Like, there was a lot going into that.
Absolutely. It almost felt like in some ways that like battles were won and lost before a question was even asked. Like I remember a really famous example of that is Ben Bateman putting Pixar on the wheel against his number 1 contender match against William Bibbiani at Spectacular. And that ended up in a lot of ways deciding the match, and him being able to put that slice on the wheel and think it would be a strength for him and a weakness for Bibbs in some way. And I'll also say the strategy not only is in the beginning when you're trying to put what's on the wheel, it moves on to when you're asked the questions because of the complexity of the questions. It's like, okay, do I go for this swing for 2 points? Do I go down the multiple choice? But going down the multiple choice, especially when you're going up against the big competitors in the league, it's like, if I go down the multiple choice, that can lose me the game. Especially, like I'll say in Star Wars, Zach Burkett went the multiple choice, I think, once in his match against Thomas Harper, and he lost the match because he went the multiple choice once. And it felt like, well, you're leaving points on the table. However, a steal always was so huge because it's not only you're losing 2 points or 1 point, your opponent's gaining those points possibly. In round one, you can miss a question, but be like, okay, it's not like my opponent gets an extra point for me missing the question. Now it's like, oh, shoot, does my opponent... And also, if you feel like it's a really tough question, do you want to go down the multiple choice to give your opponent more options if you miss? Because if you miss and go down the multiple choice, you're giving your opponent a 1/3 chance of getting that question, and you have a 1/4 chance. Are you better just being like, my opponent doesn't know this, he's just not going to know this? It's better for me to just not give him the point and for me to just be like, just do my best in that sense. I always found that interesting. It felt like there were so many different ways round two can go. You could have a perfect round, but go down to multiple choice 2 or 3 times. You can go perfect, but you could also just, get 3 every single question correct. But if you lose 1-2 point steal, that's a huge momentum decider. That's a 4-point swing. And when you're talking about a 4-point swing, that is huge game deciding type of moment.
Absolutely. And the multiple choice, making round 2 different than any of the other rounds. This was the only round that had multiple choice in it. I thought was really smart as well. Something that was built into the Schmoedown right from the very beginning was that round 2 had multiple choice in it. And I thought that lended to the excitement of round 2 very much, especially in teams. Because if neither of the competitors in the team was necessarily 100% certain of the answer, checking down a multiple choice, like you said, could open up this fewer options for the opponent's team to steal. But it also gave them, okay, let's narrow it down and have a discussion between us about which one of these options we think is the best.
Absolutely. Not only that, when you go down the multiple choice, you have to kind of get into the head of the question writers. Sometimes you would have to be able to be like, well, okay, I know it's not this actor because this actor did another movie at the same time. So that you would have to almost like you're taking a test. So there are certain skills about being able to answer a multiple choice question that just work differently sometimes, where you're like, okay, I need to eliminate the right options. That feels right. That doesn't feel right. I'm not sure about that one. It's just like, and when you in teams, to expand on what you said, what also made it feel more comfortable going down the multiple choice is like you have a partner. You and your partner, if you're using the time correctly, you talk through, hey, I'm thinking this. Oh, no, I don't think it's that. I think that person did a movie then. Or like, hey, I'm thinking this. No, I know that's not the correct answer. I think it's one of these two. It's one of these two. Or what do you feel? And just being able to do that type of stuff felt really, really interesting. And I'll also quickly say from an audience perspective, whenever you saw a competitor pause and think, it's like, oh my God, is he going down multiple choice? It always felt like, shoot, they're going to go down the multiple choice, aren't they? Even if they're just taking their time, doing a Ben Bateman, if you will. Always like, man, he might not actually know this. He might need to go down the multiple choice, which is another fascinating ripple, in my opinion, for the audience to have to think about while watching the match. It keeps you invested. It keeps you invested in the stakes in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And keeping on the theme with the teams, if you have a bad round 2 in teams, it's almost impossible to come back from. We saw that with Who's the Boss versus Shazam in season 7 when Who's the Boss got classics, and they ended up getting knocked out of that match because they had to go for it, knew they had to go for it, missed questions, and Shazam was able to steal them. And that was the stealing aspect of round 2 is one of the ones that always fascinated me for that exact reason.
Absolutely. And as I said, I think of round 2 as the climax of the match. And the climax has to matter. It has to be important. It has to be do or die stakes. You have to have that moment where it's like, if you get this wrong, you might lose the match because you want to build up to that climax. And that's, as you said, bad round 2 sunk competitors. Some competitors easily. If you got a bad type of category that you were not confident in, it could have sunk you so bad. It's why competitors were so afraid of certain categories. But it's like, listen, I have a bad round 2. It's over. It's done. Yeah, I could do everything perfectly. But if I'm not a big Tyler Perry fan and I spin Tyler Perry, then I'm like, okay, I have to go down to multiple choice each time and just hope I'm able to like kind of get it down in my head. And like, it's one of those things where it's like, but also if you have a good round 2, it's like, oh man, that's it just keeps you on pace in a way. But it could also be, not giving up any steals felt like more important than going perfect. As long as you didn't give up any steals, it felt like you were in it no matter what. But giving up one steal was do or die. Always, because of the point differential. It's either a 4-point swing or a 2-point swing. And none of those are good outcomes.
Absolutely. And certain competitors became known for certain wheel slices. You mentioned Rachel Silvestrini with Kevin Smith earlier. We also had Ben Bateman and Scott Mance with movie release dates. Those two had some battles about movie release dates throughout the years. And another one that always sticks out to me is Clark Wolf. Everybody remembers Clark Wolf in horror, but she was also excellent at Sandra Bullock questions in round 2.
Absolutely. And thinking about also that with certain competitors, it also, the wheel strategy, also it came into a thing about broad categories versus narrow categories. And that became an important part of deciding where it's like, okay, I know what the type, and again, kudos to the question writers to making broad categories and narrow categories feel different in certain ways. It's like, as a competitor, you're not only thinking about the category, you're like, man, this is a narrow category. So that means they have less to write about and you could get a really, really deep question. Where it's broad, it's like they can ask anything, but that means they have a lot to ask about. And I can probably they're probably going to, get the more famous or like, the things that people stick in their mind. You're not going to as likely to get really hardball question in some ways sometimes with the and there's exceptions with both instances, but competitors started the metagame that in a sense to be like, okay, is it broad or is it narrow? Has it been spun a bunch or has it not been spun a lot? And just to think about all the things that were used in round 2 as strategy. And also I'll say those competitors that had one slice that they could just dominate, do with their eyes closed, feel no sweat no matter what. Those competitors were so crucial and valuable, especially in teams. But it's just like when you're an opponent, and I can't speak to this personally, but it must have been terrifying to walk up to the wheel if you're facing one of those types of competitors. It's why I always found it interesting when IG players were in teams, because I'm like, if you're an IG player, you're in teams, and you can either spin or IG or have your opponent spin IG, that has to be the worst feeling in the world if you're not teamed up with an IG partner or have any IG experience. Like we saw, and we're going to get into this more deeply later on, but we saw Snyder die because of Harry Potter. Imagine him spinning Harry Potter in round 2. That would have been It's one of those things where it's like I'm sure he's walking up to that wheel just feeling sick about, man, just not Harry Potter. Just don't do Harry Potter, please, or something like that.
And he had that match against I believe it was William Bibiani when he spun 70s, and you could just see him shut down. Like he did not want that category at all, and ended up getting knocked out because of it.
It's demoralizing. It's just extremely demoralizing to just be like, okay, I have to now win this match with like basically if you're like running a race, but you have to wear 30 more pounds than your opponent. And that's basically what happens when you get a bad wheel spin. However, those competitors that were able to take those slices they didn't want, and you knew they didn't want, and still win those matches, those were some of the best swings and momentum as a fan, where it's like, oh my God, that's a really tough turn for him. Oh, he got that question right. Oh, he got that question. Oh, he's hanging in there. You need to go down to multiple choice, but he's hanging in there. There's a certain part of that where it's like, it puts the competitor sometimes in the underdog position, but we love underdogs. We absolutely love underdogs. And even if it's an unlikable player, you always feel for a competitor that's like, oh man, it's a rough wheel spin. And then for them to overcome it is some of the greatest moments of the Schmoedown.
Yeah. And one of the great moments in the round 2 too as well was overcoming opponent's choice. if you spun opponent's choice and you got that category that you weren't confident in, but you managed to navigate it enough to still be in the match heading into the final round.
I'm going to be honest. I completely forgot about opponents and spin their choice in this discussion because round 2, as I said, is so complex. There's so much going on. And when you land on opponents and spinners, it's like, man, the power is all in your opponent or you, but it's very tough to use that power effectively. We saw competitors who got spinner's choice and were and took a category and were thrown a hard ball and they weren't able to overcome it. And that's what's good about also round 2 is for the wheel spin, at least. You could be stuck with a bad category, but it's not always a death sentence, which is nice. You can get opponents, but it's not a death sentence. Your opponent can get spinners. It's not a death sentence. You're able to overcome these things, and because the questions are random, and when people talk about the randomness of the Schmoedown, I think it's one of the most important things. The Schmoedown has to be random. If it's not random, then the people like William Bibiani and Ethan Irwin are going to win every single match, and we're not going to get any excitement. The way we get upsets and the way we get people improving and getting better at the game is the randomness and trying to predict and get better from that randomness. And that's why I love spinners and opponents, because it's like the perfect amount of, oh my God, this might be over, but we all know as an audience, you can overcome this.
Absolutely. And then round 3, or the final round. We'll say the final round because it was round 5 in a championship match. The 2-point, 3-point, and 5-point questions, it came back to that randomness of you just had to pick 3 numbers, and whatever 3 numbers you picked corresponded to your questions. And if you didn't pick the right 3 numbers, or you picked 3 numbers that just didn't work out for you, that was just the way the game went. It was all down to what numbers you picked, and I liked that aspect as well.
Absolutely. Like the way I think of round 2 as the climax, to me, we're just slowly building down from the climax, but it's still pretty exciting. And what I always hearken to with round 3 is it reminds me of like the end of a basketball match or a football match, because it is a sporting event, in my opinion. It's like, man, the ball just has to bounce a certain way. You could be 1 inch off or 1 second off, and it could matter. Everything feels important in round 2, with the 2-pointer, the 3-pointer, or the 5-pointer. And you just like, man, it might just not go your way. Sometimes you might just get a 5-pointer where it's like, man, I got a 5-pointer, and that's a 5-pointer, and I'm not going to get that. And that's the worst feeling in the world. But it's sometimes the ball doesn't bounce your way. Sometimes you can shoot a million 3-pointers, but Steph Curry doesn't go 100 for 100 when he's shooting threes. And those end of game decisions in some ways, and those end of game moments to try and get, it felt very clutch. It's the people who can come out of round 3 and get wins all the time felt clutch. It felt like they were clutch and were able to bring it in, and that's a very important thing in my opinion. But it really does feel like, man, the ball might not bounce my way, and that's okay, because sometimes it doesn't do that. And the stakes were so high because even if you're leading, you're like, man, my opponent forces me to answer some questions. I could get some questions that just aren't on my wheelhouse. So it never felt like the game was over, even though if the lead was super big. Or I'll say, if it was over 6 to 7 points, that was tough. But like, it felt like if you're within that 5-point gap, the game's not over, and both competitors are on their toes because the leading player doesn't want to answer any questions, and the underdog or the trailing player wants to force them to answer as many questions as possible.
Yeah, and that made for some incredible tension in this round over the course of the 9 seasons of the Schmoedown. The fact that it was just so left up to chance, whether you got something that was in your wheelhouse or not, for that crucial question that would either win you the game or knock you out, was just, it was fascinating to watch, especially as some competitors would choose different numbers every match, and some competitors had their 3 numbers that they wanted every match, even though they didn't know what categories those were going to go with. Let's talk about the 2-pointer first.
Yeah.
It was similar to round 1 in that it was a good warm up to the rest of the final round, but it wasn't ever a gimme question.
Yeah, it was something where it's like, okay, this isn't going to be extremely difficult. It's probably going to be very similar, honestly, to a round 2 question. except in this round 2 question, you don't have multiple choice. It's like, I honestly feel like some round 2 questions are more difficult than round 3 questions. Difficulty is always subjective and stuff, but it felt like at least if you take all the 2-pointers from round 3 and all the 2-pointers and 1-pointers from round 2 and 1, it felt like the 2-pointers from round 3 was somewhere in the middle between round 1 and round 2 in difficulty.
Yes.
But it never felt like a gimme because like you have moments like I remember Brendan Meyer missing a 2-pointer against the Odd Couple, and I think he missed 1 or 2 in his career in teams. But whenever you miss a 2-pointer, it's like, man, because I remember especially also Ben Bateman against Dan Murrell the second time. He was up by I think either he was around 7 or 6. I think it might have been 6, and then he misses that 2-pointer, and you're like, ooh, that means that Dan can force him to hit the 5, and that or if it meant Ben was definitely going to have to hit his 5. And whenever you're forced to hit the 5, that's really what it is. It's like the other great thing about round 3 is because actually we'll get into this when we get into round 5. But like I think again, praise to the question writers. The question writers did a great job. It always felt like the right difficulty in round 2. There's very few round 2 questions. I mean, I keep saying round 2. 2-pointer questions from round 3 or the final round that felt too difficult. It always felt like the right difficulty. It was always subjective, but always good. And it felt like, okay, this isn't a gimme, but this also isn't something that like is going to test your knowledge to the point that the 3 and 5-pointers are going to.
Absolutely. And that 3-pointer would come up next, and it could be sneaky dangerous sometimes. I remember some of the 3-pointers, to me, in my limited movie knowledge, were sometimes more difficult than some of the 5-pointers could be, just because I felt like you got more context sometimes in a 5-point question than you did in a 3-point question.
Absolutely. And again, praise to the question writers. They're able to make that difference feel known and make the 3-pointers so different than the 2-pointers, even though there's 1-point difference. And it felt like they had a lot of different ways, whether it was give less context for a question, or maybe it was to like talk about a movie that no one thinks about as much anymore, but it's still a movie and we're giving you the director and the cast or the year or something. Or maybe it's just like, hey, this is something that should be in your minds because it was in the trailer, but the movie was like 10 years ago. So like, even though this is a very famous thing from this movie, the movie's 10 years ago, and it's specifically like the way you know this is from the trailer in some ways. So like that 3-point question, it's like, it's why it's like, man, 2-pointer, you always assume the competitor was going to get the 2. The 3-pointer is when you start to hold your breath as the audience, where it's like, okay, here's the 3-pointer. Just get the 3-pointer. Come on, please get the 3-pointer. If you're rooting for, if you're rooting against, you're like, you feel like, oh, this person can miss the 3-pointer. And the more time they take on the 3-pointer, the more real it feels. It's like if you, as a fan, I would always do this. You look at the competitor's face, and it's like, man, is he just like thinking about it, or is he really not know? Like, and especially like whenever someone used JTE on a 3-pointer. That felt especially brutal because it's like, man, the 5-pointer's right there. 5-pointer's right there, and you had to use a JTE on a 3-pointer, which you should have if you don't know the 3-pointer, obviously. But something that just feels like such a missed opportunity because, you know, the 5-pointer is the 5-pointer. And we're going to get into that about the 5-pointer and go into detail about that. But, man, I love the 3-pointer. I think the 3-pointer, even more than the 5-pointer sometimes, is what made the final round work in a lot of ways, just the structure of it.
Let's talk about the 5-pointer. It can be a great equalizer. It can be the thing that sinks you in the end after a valiant attempt at a comeback. It can be the thing that you have to answer to win a match. And we've seen all of that and many more different scenarios with the 5-pointer over the years. It seems to me that a lot of the way that the game was structured was to avoid having to answer your 5-pointer. Like, you want to make sure you don't have to answer your 5-pointer, but that's not up to you. That's up to how your opponent is doing. Talk a little bit about the 5-pointer and maybe some examples we have of how the 5-pointer played into matches over the years.
Absolutely. So the 5-pointer, as you said, it's a great equalizer. It's why competitors going into round 1, 2, and 3 have to stay within 5 points. You have to stay within 5 points. And why you have to stay within 5 points? because if you answer all your question, you force your opponent to hit the 5-pointer. As long as you stay within 5 points, I have a shot, even if I'm going against the toughest bad guy, because I know the 5-pointer can I can get my 5-pointer and my opponent can miss theirs, and that is always going to be the great equalizer. It's why even if you're down by 4 or 3, even though that's something that's tough to come back from, as long as you get your 5-pointer get the 2 and 3, you just make your opponent sweat, where it's like, okay, you can get a 5-pointer, and some 5-pointers are brutal. Like we saw Ben Bateman struggle a couple times with the 5-pointers, with especially that heavyweights question in his match against the first match against Dan and the second match against Dan. I think Bibbs lost a couple matches early on because of the 5-pointer or the round 3, because just having trouble and getting some unlucky breaks in that sense. And it's just something where it's like, man, 5-pointer is just brutal in a lot of ways, as it should be. It's the last question of the game. It's worth 5 points. That's five times the amount of what one question is worth 5 round 1 questions, and at most 3, or at least 3 round 2 questions, and also the other questions are round 2. So because of that, it has to be more difficult. It has to be something that's like not impossible, but also extremely like, okay, you got to know your stuff. And whenever you hit a 5-pointer, it was like, oh, that's a crazy pull.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember some incredible comebacks that have come about from one player hitting the 5-pointer and the other player missing the 5-pointer. The one example that we have here is Odd Couple's final round comeback against Shazam at Spectacular during season 7. That was a big 5-point question there. Adam Collins missed the 5-point question in his rematch against Dan Murrell in season 8 that put the belt back on Murrell. And we had a crazy match in season 5 where Sam Levine and Clark Wolf were playing for the title, and they both missed every single question in the final round, which was just nuts to me. Thinking back, especially given how great those two players were. But like we talked about earlier, it's all about what numbers you pick and the randomness of the categories that come up.
Absolutely. And I'll add one more is the tournament final against Mike and Mara. I think Mike was leading the majority of the round, and then he just gets hit with a 5-pointer, which might go down as one of the most difficult 5-pointers of all time. It's like, what was Tony Stark's nickname for like the left arm? Which, by the way, we should also just discuss IG 5-pointers. Whole different animal.
Totally brutal.
The fact that people were able to answer some IG 5-pointers, I'm like, oh my god, that is like the markings of a champion sometimes, because
and don't even get me started on Star Wars 5-pointers. I could never answer a Star Wars final round question ever.
Absolutely, but listen, the 5-pointer is just. It's a lot, man, and there's a reason why the whole game was building to that 5-pointer. You wanted to build to the end, even though I said that the second round is the climax. Everything is building to that 5-pointer, and you just feel the tension and feel the. And I honestly think you could look at some competitors and see how many times they answered their 5-pointer to the win, and you'll be surprised about like how little some competitors did, because they were just able to be in the lead for the first and second round, and then they didn't have to answer their 5 because their opponent missed the 5, which, by the way, just shows the importance of the first and second round, because if you're leading, you avoid the 5. You can possibly avoid the 5-pointer, which if you can avoid the 5-pointer, that's ideal, because all the 5-pointers are like a whole new level of difficulty. So I completely agree. You brought up some great examples, and I'm sure if you have any other examples, by the way, for our round 1, round 2, round 3, final round, feel free to put those in the comments for sure, or your most memorable moments, or what moments exemplified that round, if you will. But yeah, there's a couple of 5-pointers where we can just look back and be like, ooh boy, okay, that's a question.
Yeah. There were some brutal ones in the final round. Championship matches, of course, had 2 other rounds in them. The third round was a betting round, which I always liked the betting round. It gave a different feel to anything else that was going on in the match, because this was the one time that you put points that you had earned up as a wager. And there was incredible risk in this round. If you bet 3 points and got a category that you thought you were confident in, but then you got a question that was like, ooh, I don't know about that, and didn't get the answer, there could be 6-point swings in this round, depending on the match.
Absolutely. And like what's so interesting is like you don't know the difficulty of the question. It could be a 1-pointer, could be a 2-pointer, 3-pointer, 5-pointer. You have no idea the difficulty of the question heading in. So you could go into a category you feel extremely confident, like, hey, I'm the biggest Steven Spielberg fan in the world. And then you get a 5-point question and you're like, okay, that was a 5-point question. And so that's just the risk involved with it. And what I love about it is it's a true gambling. We don't call it the betting round for nothing. You are betting, you are gambling. And to me, that's what made it feel so different in a lot of ways. Like you said, it's like, man, you got to do the math in your head. Like, can I afford the gamble a lot, or do I play it on the safer side? I would also quickly say when you're losing in the match, it feels like you always have to do 3 points. In fact, there were moments I think in teams where it's like you just have to bet 3 points. It doesn't matter. You have to bet 3 points because especially when you're going up against a team like Shazam, where it's like you can't give up any headway against a team like Shazam. So it's like because it's just awful feeling where it's like you know the answer, but you only bet 2 points and your opponent bet 3, and now they are 1 point ahead of you, or they gained a point on that, and that's the worst feeling in the world. And it's so interesting to see which competitors would go very always bet 3 and just trust your knowledge, and which competitors were on the more cautious side. But also, some people would think it's always good to bet 3. You just always bet 3 because you cannot afford to give any leeway. Because would also quickly say it's a championship match. You are going up against a champion, or you are the number one contender. You're going up against a very hungry number 1 contender. You have a championship level opponent. You cannot give. It feels like any ground you give up to that opponent could cause you to lose the match. However, the true champions, or the people to know when to back off, is what also is extremely important. Dan Murrell betting 0 points against Ben Bateman in the Tyler Perry match is absolutely, because he was losing in that match and he had to just be like, Ben's betting 3, he's going to get it right, I'm probably going to bet 0, and I'm no matter what happens, he's got 3 points on me. I just have to spot him 3 points in this match or this round, and it worked. It's the reason he won the match. And we look at Snyder spun Harry Potter in the betting round, and him betting 1 point meant going into it was tied, and it went in overtime. He doesn't, if he does the Dan Murrell thing, bets 0, match is over, Snyder wins. Snyder becomes a singles champion, which, by the way, we look at Jeff Snyder a lot differently if he was a singles champion and a multiple times teams champion. But because he never got the singles belt, we look at him a certain, or I wouldn't say we look at him a certain way, but like it's just there's a difference between being a singles and team champion and just being a team champion. I mean, there's a lot of moments where it felt like it was just a turning point, and it's truly random. And again, I love the randomness of the Schmoedown. I think building randomness into your structure is what makes the Schmoedown so compelling and what makes it work so well. I think Irwin versus Marisol, the first one, the championship match, that one was a huge swing in the betting round. I believe Marisol got it correct, and Irwin didn't get it correct, and it was like a 5 to 6 point swing, and it was brutal.
Yeah, there were some big swings in championship matches in the betting round for sure. There were also some swings in what was the 4th round of a championship match, which was the speed round. Now, this was a little bit different, whether they were in studio or it was in the digital era. But the buzzers in the speed round, if you were good at those buzzers and you practice a lot with buzzers leading into that match, you had an edge that if your reaction time wasn't quite as fast on those buzzers, you could be, losing out to your opponent. And then the thing about the speed round that I always enjoyed with the buzzers as well was if you buzz in, but you don't answer in 2 seconds, you lose the point. And that was another thing that was a massive swing in that round.
Absolutely. The speed round just goes so fast, and that leads to greater tension. It means it leads to it feeling like it's over, but also like it's so extremely important, but it goes by so fast. And also, because it's the last round before round 5, it's like you're going into that match. If you're competitive, if you're leading, it's like I gotta get my lead above 5 points. I don't want to answer the 5-pointer. So you feel a greater need of like, listen, I need to answer this quickly so I can build a lead, so I don't have to answer the 5. And if you're trailing, you're like, I can't get below 5 points. I don't want my opponent not to answer his 5. I want to force him to answer his 5. I need to answer these fast. Both competitors feel such a layer of tension because it's the last round before the final round. And because of that, it's like it makes them both very hungry to get as many points as you can. And also, you don't want to spot your opponents any points in any round because the game is so crucial. We just mentioned two huge championship matches, whether it's Snyder versus Oyama or Merrill versus Bateman, the first one that went to overtime. And every single point matters. Every single point always matters in these types of matches.
Absolutely. And then during the digital era, we had the fast money round where I believe, was it 10 questions?
It was.
They had a minute to answer them.
Yeah.
And then there were some big swings in that as well. If you got a bunch of questions and you said an answer quickly and it wasn't the correct one, you were losing up to 10 points in that round, or you were gaining up to 10 points in that round. And that really affected a couple of matches in the digital era.
Absolutely. And what's interesting about the difference between the two is like there is such a physical aspect of reaction time when it comes to the speed round without non-digitally. And for some ways to kind of contradict that, you have to be like, I don't have a great reaction time. Well, I'm going to answer the question before it's finished, which we had a lot of great moments of competitors answering the question before the announcer even finishes. And I think there was one Bibbs moment where it's like, he got like one piece of information, quickly answered it out of nowhere. It's like, oh my God, how did he answer it that quickly? I think it was against corruption, but I don't remember the moment 100% well. But it's just like when you answer the question quickly like that, I love that there's a physical aspect of it, in my opinion. I think there's one part of the game that should be some sort of physical aspect. The fact they were able to build it in this way, where it doesn't feel like it's all physical, where you can mentally shortcut physical defects by answering the question quicker or by being a bit more on tune or something. It's just, I really like that. It felt like it wasn't like the person who is more physically fit will always win, but there is an aspect of it. There is a reason for that. And then when it comes to the digital, the fast money, it's all mental. It's all mental. And in fact, a lot of the speed round is mental, both sides of it, but it being all mental and it being like, man, I don't know if the competitors knew how much time they had left when they were answering those questions, but even if you did, it would be very tough to like split your mind where it's like, wait, how much time do I have? Wait, the question. How much time do I have? The question. Like, so they probably have to go in as like, man, I don't know how much time I have left. And I just have to answer these as fast as I can.
Yeah. Was there a speed round in a championship match that really stood out to you as a memorable
I feel
one?
like every single Shazam versus Corruption match, the speed round always felt like extremely important and extremely interesting. Whether it was like one of them, Chance absolutely dominated and was able to keep Corruption in it. And I will also quickly say the most memorable one and the most infamous one is MODOK falling apart against the Patriots because of the accents.
Mm-hmm.
And
trying to stay in character. Yeah.
One of the most brutal matches. And it just shows like, listen, you can be great character-wise, but like there's certain moments in the game you can't bring character into it. You have to be all business to be a champion. And the accents, it's like what's crazy about it is that I never ceases to amaze me. It's not like they did it once and they lost 1 point off it. They kept doing it. It's like they kept doing the accents, and it's like you lost a point. And then they do the accents again, lost a point. Then do the accents again, lost a point. It's like, what? It's just like your hands in your head. Like you didn't stop doing the accents after the first 2 times. I believe they lost 3 points because of the accents. I'm pretty sure, but it's just absolutely crazy. And it's just like tension in the margin for error is so little. And the fact that MODOK made it more difficult on themselves, it's just it's one of the most infamous moments in Schmoedown history for many reasons because of that. And it's just, it just shows you the margin for error so little, but also it's hard to talk about the speed round and not bring up that match just because of how famous it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we go through a match, we go through all 3 or 5 rounds, depending on what the match is, and the score is still tied. So now we have overtime. Let's talk a little bit about overtime and the way that it worked and why that made for such compelling finishes to these matches, because it's very similar to round 1, but it's not exactly the same as round 1. And we had some famous matches end in overtime.
Absolutely, absolutely. What I love about overtime is the simplicity of it. You don't want overtime to be overcomplicated, in my opinion. You don't want it to have multiple different types of rules like the other different rounds. To me, it's just like, listen, you answer a question, whoever misses the question first, and the other one gets it, it's over. And that's how most overtimes are. It's like, listen, you get for basketball 5 more minutes, and then whoever is leading after 5 minutes. But even that's a bit different than football, where it's like, listen, you score a touchdown, it's over. Field goal, other team gets a chance. And I know they changed overtime rules in the playoffs. I'm not going to get into that, obviously, but like
it's complicated.
Yeah, it's more complicated than it should be. I actually like the fact that it's like, listen, you score a touchdown, it's over. I actually like the previous format of just being like, listen, I'm sorry the other quarterback didn't get a chance. Have a better defense. The defense matters. That's why the defense matters. That's a football rant. I apologize in the Schmoedown talk, but no, I love the simplicity.
But the Schmoedown overtime worked because it was so simple, though.
It was. It's just like, listen, you missed the question, your opponent gets it, it's over. You can have both miss it, and the game continues. You can both get it, the game continues. And it's just like, hey, listen, next person to miss is over. And that's the simplicity of it, and it works because it's like any question could be the end. And what I love also, there's no category for each question. Sometimes competitors would be able to get a question because it's like, okay, this is Julia Roberts' category. I know she was in that movie. This sounds like the right time period. Let's do that. But if you're not have any category, it's just like, okay, you have even less information, which I like. Got to make it more difficult. You can't make it round 1 because if you make it round 1, then it's just going to go on forever at some moments or have like 15 to 20 question overtimes. You don't really want that. You want it to be a really tense 5 to like 12 at most, in my opinion. Once it gets over 12, unless it happens once. If it happens once, then you know what? This is a historic match because it happens once. You don't want competitors consistently going 20 rounds in the overtime because that leads to a bad product because it's going way too long. You want the Schmoedown to be around an hour usually, or the matches themselves to be like 30 to 40 minutes. You don't want an hour and 20 matches that isn't a championship match. And even the championship matches, like they're long times. It's a long time to sit. So I really love the no category for each question.
I love that too. And of course, the most famous, I think, version of overtime that we ever saw was Alex Damon versus Andrew DiMolanta. We had everything in that overtime. We had correct answers. We had the awarding of the match to Alex Damon, then the challenge by DiMolanta. No, DiMolanta gets the point too. We keep going. And then Damon just not having enough time to write down his answer, thinking of it right after the time is called, and Andrew DiMolanta dethroning Alex Damon. That's for me personally my favorite match in the Schmoedown, just because it had everything, the tension and all of that, and the fact that it ended in overtime and the way that it ended in overtime, I think made that match even more great than it already was.
And what also added to that overtime specifically was because neither competitor missed. They didn't even have go to multiple choice once or not bet 3 or something, or they both went 10 for 10 in the speed round because it was digital. If it was buzzers, it wouldn't have gone that way. But the fact that neither of them missed, it's like, oh, it actually is first person to miss loses this match. First person to get a brain fart. It wasn't even a knowledge thing, like you said. It was Damon just being like, couldn't get there fast enough. And what I'll also quickly say, I love that each competitor gets 1 JTE and that's it. It's not 3 JTEs. It's like, listen, you gotta use that JTE smartly because, like, listen, you only get one of them. So, like, absolutely agree with that. I'm trying to think of other ones, and it's very easy for all these to just talk about.
Yeah, sorry, another one that did in overtime is Rachel versus Mara in the Inner Geekdom tournament.
Oh, absolutely.
That was the sick game, if you will, for both of them. That incredibly sick that day. That's one of my favorite Inner Geekdom matches, just seeing these two titans of the game go at it and then going into overtime. And then I believe the question that was missed on was about Captain America, and Rachel answered Superman, but it was Captain America, and Mara ended up winning that match. There were just overtime made for some great moments.
Absolutely, and I'll also mention the Shazam versus Corruption match, and I mentioned those matches a lot because I think the greatest matches, when you talk about the structure of the game, there's a reason those matches are so great because it's the competitors, but it's also the structure lifting up the competitors in a lot of way. And the fact that like Chance and Mike, what for one of the questions wrote, I think North Carolina, and the answer was South Carolina, was just crazy, and they end up losing that match. It's just such a, as you said, there's so many memorable moments that come from overtime. I completely agree.
Absolutely. Well, Josh, we've made it through the entire structure of the Schmoedown. I had a lot of fun.
We got through the first episode, everyone. I had a blast. Got through the first episode. I'm excited for the next one. Apologies. But everyone, please like, comment, subscribe, and listen. Let us know if we missed anything about the structure that you thought about when about this discussion. If you have any moments you want to bring up that we didn't mention that you thought would be a great example of why the structure works so well, or anything at all, put it in those comments. We'd love to hear them and hear your thoughts about this. Excited to talk about Schmoedown again, and I'm excited to always share the screen with the great Adelia. I really appreciate it, and just happy to be here, and I'm excited for the future episodes to come.
Absolutely. I had so much fun talking about Schmoedown with you, Josh, and talking about Schmoedown again in general. I know that like it's not the first thing on a lot of people's minds anymore, but it still crosses my mind pretty often, and going back and rewatching old matches and things. Thank you to everyone who tuned in and watched this video. We have a Patreon, patreon.com/LGR_network. $1 a month gets you into a Discord. We have 3 other tiers, one of which is the LGR family tier, where we do watch-alongs of movies. We're doing one. We just did one by the time this comes out for It Happened One Night, a movie I've never seen before, suggested for me to watch by one of our patrons, Brandy. And so looking forward to that. The $15 tier, you get to dictate the content on the channel and make us do a video about something that you want and choose who on the team does that video. So lots of good stuff over there. Go check it out. Patreon.com/LGR_network. That really helps out the channel a lot. And we will be back next month with another topic. And it will be exciting to see where we go from here. But like we said before, this is a monthly show, not a weekly show.
Yeah.
So we will see you all next month.
Absolutely. Bye. See you guys next month.
It's for real.